Ave Maria.
He said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost." They therefore gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves that remained over and above unto them that had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, "This is in truth the prophet that should come into the world." And Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him king. He departed again into the mountain, himself alone. And when evening was come, the disciples went down to the sea, and they entered into a ship and went over the sea towards Capernaum. And it was now dark, and Jesus had not come to them. And the sea arose by reason of a great wind and blew. So when they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, and drawing nigh unto the ship, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they willingly received him into the ship, and immediately the ship was at land, whither they went. St. John relates the effects of our Lord's miracle, both on the disciples as well as on the people. The crowd consisted of 5,000 men, not mentioning, not counting women and children. And even that was men who were above the age of 20, because according to the Mosaic law, only those who were fit to fight, which had to be an adult 20 years old, could be counted in any census. So it was a vast crowd. And when they saw the miracle that the Lord had performed, their immediate reaction is to think this is the prophet that has long been expected. Now, there were many prophets, and the prophets initially were seers. That is, they foresaw what was to come, and they would make certain predictions. But these predictions were always conditional, because the Lord was guiding his people towards righteousness. And we are a stubborn lot, so we need constant guidance. And frequently the prophets would instruct and teach. In fact, the teaching was far more important than what they predicted. And this is exactly what our Lord was doing. He'd been teaching them. And now he worked the miracle to confirm the teaching. And so since prophecy had apparently ended, the people thought, it's come back, and here is the prophet that Moses had spoken of. Even the authorities, the Pharisees, thought that the time of prophecy had come, because they went down to John and asked him, "Are you the prophet?" To which John said, no, he wasn't. So the people now think that Christ is the prophet. And what is the result? When they decided that they wanted him as king. So we're told in verse 15, when Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him king, he went back into the mountains. So at the beginning, our Lord was in the mountain. The crowds had gathered. He came down. He taught them. He'd worked the miracle. And they want to make him king. But the Lord cannot be made king, because he is a king. I was born a king, is what he would tell Pilate. And in any case, his kingdom was not of this kind. It was not a kingdom that would be made by men, but rather it was a kingdom that would come from heaven. Thy kingdom come. And so our Lord escaped. He went back into the mountain so that the crowds could not find him. His mind, our Lord's although our Lord came to establish a kingdom, and he said this to the disciples, although he came to establish a kingdom, the time for this kingdom had not yet arrived. It was inopportune. The kingdom could only be established once he had died and had risen from the dead, because he had to destroy the kingdom of sin, the kingdom of Satan. When that was done, his own kingdom would appear. And so he goes back into the mountains. And so we see that from this, mystically, that our Lord will teach us from the heights. He will come down and fulfill our needs in the feeding. But if we do not respond correctly, he will go back into the mountains. St. Matthew, who relates this same miracle, tells us that Jesus said to the disciples to go to Capernaum, get into the boat and go to Capernaum, while he himself would remain to send the people away. It is during this time, in fact, that the people decide to declare him king, and he escapes. The disciples, meanwhile, are at the boat waiting for our Lord. Evening has come, and in a sense, evening means the absence of Christ, because he is the light of the world. And the disciples think, well, he did say to go across the sea, so they got into the boat and start to sail across the sea. And we're told they entered the ship and went over the sea towards Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not come to them. We're told that it was in the third watch. So it's about midnight, between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning, when the storm breaks out. And it is a particularly vicious storm. The storms, certainly the boat in which the disciples were, reminds us of the church. The storms of the tribulation that occurs. And these tribulations, the storm comes because there's essentially an absence of love. Because Christ is our love. And if he's not there, invariably we are overwhelmed by the tribulations of life. It is not that he does not love us, but we do not love him sufficiently. Because if we did love, we would trust. Therefore, when the storm breaks out, the disciples are exceedingly afraid. And one thing we know, they were certainly wide awake. And it is at this point they see the Lord walking on the water, and they are terrified, according to St. Matthew. They think it's a ghost, whereas St. John says they were afraid. A great wind blew, and the more they're far out at sea, and they are even further distance from the other side, from Capernaum, and our Lord is walking. And as he drew near to them, he calls out to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." And so he addresses the two aspects of our fear. One is our understanding. If we do not understand what is happening to us, we become afraid. And so he, by saying, "It is I," he's telling them, I am present, you don't need, you know me. I'm not a ghost. He would say the same thing, of course, after his resurrection. Touch and see, I'm not a ghost. A spirit doesn't have flesh and bones. So I'm not a ghost, it's I. And then the emotions, because even though we understand, the emotions can take control of us. And so we become fearful because we don't feel safe. And so by saying, "Do not be afraid," he's calming the emotions as well. And in this, the psalm is fulfilled. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Because the light is for the mind and the salvation is for the body. And so in calming them, they ask him, he makes to come into the boat. And St. Matthew's Gospel, it says he was about to enter when suddenly they're on land. And that's it. So we have three miracles. First of all, our Lord walking on the water. Secondly, when he calls out, the wind stops and there's a calm. And then thirdly, they've arrived. And of course, this miracle, this is triple miracle, they're going to find incredibly. They just cannot believe it. Peter even walked across, said to the Lord, if it's you, let me come to you across the water. These miracles that our Lord works are always to reinforce the truth of his teaching or to demonstrate his divinity. Only God could do the things that he did because they are essentially suspension of the laws of nature. And so even in the current time in which we live, where the church, again, is in a turmoil, a storm, we know it is because of the lack of warmth in our love for Christ. But even in the midst of the storm, let us be convinced, let us be certain that he is still with us and that there is nothing for us to be afraid. Even if the heavens should fall, we know that the love of God itself is always for us and will protect us from every danger. The tribulations are necessary, even as the sufferings of Christ are necessary, because this is the means by which our faith is strengthened. And of course, with a strong faith, we will persevere to the end. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Santa Maria, Mater Dei,